Hey guys, welcome back to another painting guide. This time let's talk about wet pellets. Do you need one for miniature painting? The answer is yes to that one, by the way. How to use them, the do's and don'ts, which one you should buy, and a couple of tricks to get even more out of them.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURE.
Let's start by talking about the first question a little, just so we are on the same page. Do you need a wet palette and why?
Well, if you are watching this video, it probably means that you are either already into miniature painting or you are interested in getting into it. If you are already painting minis with acrylic paints and you don't use a wet palette, then you most likely struggle to get decent paint jobs and you probably don't enjoy the hobby as much as you could. If you are new to this whole mini painting craziness and you are trying to figure out what you need before jumping in, please put a wet palette on your list of stuff to purchase. Without it, you will hate painting and you will bounce off of the hobby. It is not a luxury purchase that you can make once you are already doing it. You need it from the get-go and it is just as essential as paints, brushes and paper towels. Wait, why is this guy talking about paper towels in a wet palette video? Well, we will get to that later. Okay, that is all well and good, but why is it so essential to have one? Well, acrylic paints are great, but they have a nasty habit of drying on you super fast and you need to constantly modify their consistency with water while you're painting.
They are basically like that friend who will be the soul of the party as long as they get constant refills, but they turn into a party pooper as soon as their alcohol level decreases. A wet palette is basically an open bar for your acrylic paint, so you don't have to worry about buying them a new drink before they run dry. Plus, you always have a place to get them a shot if they need the extra buzz.
What I'm trying to say with this awesome analogy is that a wet palette is the place where you put all the paint you are using for a project, where you keep them hydrated to prevent them from drying, and also where you mix them both with water and with each other. And you can even store them between painting sessions to a certain degree. Technically, you could try to paint from the pot if you are using Citadel paints, but please don't do that. Your models will look like melted wax figures since you won't be able to control the consistency of the paint. Alternatively, you could also use a traditional palette, one made out of plastic or maybe a paper palette. But if you do that, you will have to constantly add water to the paint, and if you leave for 10 minutes, it will be dry by the time you get back. I know that in the Games Workshop videos they use a paper palette, but that is only because they don't sell wet palettes for some reason, so they don't want to show other brands in their content. I bet that off camera they use a wet palette as well.
Okay, so hopefully I convinced you that you need one. So before I go into how to use it, the first questions we need to answer is, can you make one? And if you want to buy one, which one?
Yes, you can actually make one with stuff that most people will have lying about in the house or you can easily get in your local supermarket. All it takes is some kind of shallow plastic container like an old Tupperware or the box of some kind of prepackaged food, and then a kitchen sponge wipe and some baking paper. You put the sponge wipe in the box, add in enough water to completely soak the sponge and leave a little around it. Then you put the baking paper on top and there you go, you have your DIY wet palette.
This is how I started when I began painting, but I will actually advise you to not do this. It might look like a nice cheap option to tide you over until you figure out whether you really need it or not.
But it will be incredibly inferior to an actual wet palette. The sponge won't hold the water as well, and depending on what type of baking paper you get, it might let way too much or not nearly enough water through.
My advice is to buy a relatively cheap and small wet palette. I started with this one from the Army Painter, and to be honest, I kinda hated it. Somehow I'm never really satisfied with their stuff, but maybe that's just me. The next one I bought was this one from Redgrass Games, and I really like this one. I still use it occasionally for smaller projects. It lets just the right amount of water through, it is nice and low profile, it's great. Nowadays I use this huge XXL palette from Green Stuff World, and to me this is basically the perfect palette. The size allows me to use a single sheet of paper for even a bigger project, and I don't feel constantly restrained by the space I have for the paints.
These things are not exactly expensive considering how much we already pay for a box of models. Even the big one I use costs less than half a box of Marines, and one of these will last you for years and years. You don't really need to replace it. What you do need to replace is the foam and the paper sheets. The foam I usually use for several months. I think I used the last one for half a year or so, but they also cost like $2-3 per foam, so not the end of the world. But the sheets are something I use for a single project only and then throw them away when I am done or when the sheet is completely full of paint. I know that it seems wasteful and another expense in an already expensive hobby, but realistically it is a couple of cents per project since a pack of 50 sheets costs $3 or $4.
All in all, this is probably one of the best bang for your buck when it comes to mini painting tools. Low cost and high impact, what's there not to like? Awesome, so now that you have a wet palette or you are about to get one, let's see how to use one and some do's and don'ts I have discovered while I have been using them in the past years.
As far as the initial setup goes, wet palettes are about as simple as they come. You simply place the foam in the palette and start adding water. In my experience, the ideal amount of water is when the foam is completely saturated, plus there is water all around it but without covering the foam. If the water is halfway to the top of the foam, you are golden. Now you take the paper sheet and, taking care not to crease it, you place it on top of the foam. If the sheet is floating on top of the foam, you added too much water and you should remove some. Ideally though, it should cling to the foam and there will be probably a couple of bubbles that you can get rid of by wiping the surface of the paper gently with the heel of your hand, pushing the air out on the sides. During your painting session, you will probably have to refill some of the water to keep everything nice and wet. A little squirty bottle like this is great for it, since you can use the beak to squirt the water under the sheet around the edge without getting any on the surface of the sheet. As you get more experience, you will realize that the amount of water in the palette influences the consistency of the paint. When you have more water, the paint will be automatically thin more, and when the water is drying out, the paint on the paper will become a little thicker. You can use this effect to your advantage during the painting process, for example letting the water run a bit lower when you are edge highlighting so you get thicker consistency. My setup with the palette usually looks like this. I have the palette on my right since I'm right-handed, with a mug full of water just above it and a couple of folded sheets of paper towel tucked under the palette. You might think that the paper towel is only there to keep things neat or something like that, but it is actually just as essential a part of the wet palette as the foam or the paper sheet. In the beginning of the video I told you that the wet palette allows you to constantly manipulate the consistency of the paint to use different techniques on the Mini, and that is why we have the mug and the paper towel there. Just imagine that the mug of water is a big plus sign and the paper towel is a big minus sign. When you need more water in the paint because let's say you need to glaze or simply need slightly thinner paint, you hit the plus sign and add some water from the mug. But when the paint is too diluted and you need a slightly thicker consistency, you need to hit the minus sign by loading the brush with paint and then removing some of the moisture on the paper towel before applying the paint on the figure. In practice this looks like this. Whenever I need a new color, I put some from the bottle onto the wet palette. I rinse my brush in the mug to remove any of the previous paint or just to make it moist before loading it.
Now I have to decide if I need thicker or thinner paint. Depending on that, I will remove more or less water from the brush on the towel before loading the brush with paint.
Then I load the brush and I will either start painting immediately if I like the consistency I have in the brush, or if it's a bit too thin, I can wipe it on the towel again gently to remove some of the excess moisture. Then I proceed to paint as long as there is enough paint in the brush and then repeat the same process again.
Okay, now we know how to use the wet palette, so let's talk about some do's and don'ts and some tricks and tips.
First of all, you need to consider mold. This thing is constantly wet, and if you don't take care of it, it might develop some mold, in which case you have to throw away the foam and the sheet and really give the palette a good scrub before using it again.
Fortunately, you can avoid mold relatively easily with a couple of easy steps.
First of all, if you don't use the wet palette for a long period of time, let's say you are going on a trip or holiday or something, you should dry the palette and the foam out. Don't just let it sit there for weeks, it will be nasty by the time you get back. Don't ask me how I know this. In my experience, you should not fully close the palette either between sessions. Usually I leave a little crack between the lid and the bottom part so it gets a little air. It can survive even a couple of days like this, and I can simply refill it with water when I start a new session. And finally, and this will sound funny, but put something made out of copper under the foam. Like a copper penny if you have one, or in my case some pieces of copper wire. This might sound complete BS, but it actually works.
Copper has some really cool antimicrobial properties, so it literally kills mold around it. I found this tip on Reddit at some point, and since then I don't have any mold issues. Thank you, random Reddit person.
Moving on from the mold issue, here is one in the don'ts category. Please don't take water from the side of the palette to thin your paint. You have a mug of water for that. If you do this, you will contaminate the water and ultimately the foam with paint. It won't be the end of the world, but it will look nasty and you will have to change your foams faster.
I have seen some YouTubers do this and cringe every time. It's almost as bad as licking your brush. Just please don't.
For the same reason, also don't put the paint so close to the edge of the sheet that it touches the foam and seeps into it. It will ruin not only the water and the foam, but your paint patch will soak up the water and it will be unusable as well. Another tip is to know when your paint is done. Unfortunately, even with the wet palette, you can't use paint indefinitely. As it sits there, the pigments will slowly separate from the medium and at some point it will become unusable.
You might be tempted to save paint by not adding more of the same color while you still have quite a bit of that color on your sheet. But this might lead you to struggling with achieving coverage or not being able to get the right consistency since the paint is just not behaving as it should anymore.
So learn when to cut your losses and simply add another patch of the same color and enjoy the fresh consistency.
Finally, here's a weird one. You can have favorite spots for certain colors in your wet palette, so by reflex you know where to move your brush when you need something.
For example, I always start by putting a patch of black paint in the upper left corner of the palette and usually a little white paint next to it. By the end of the project, my palette usually looks like an impressionist painter had a bad LSD trip, but I always have my black and white paints in the same familiar spots so I can access them easily.
And with that, I think we got to the end of this tutorial. If I missed something or got something wrong, please let me and the other viewers know in the comments section. Hopefully you got some useful information out of this, and if you did, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I have a lot of guide content already with a lot more to come. And before I sign off, I wanted to also call you guys' attention to my Patreon. You can find a ton of PDF and longer form video guides on there, and by subbing you get access to all of them. Plus you can also support me and the channel. It's only a couple of bucks for you, but it helps me tremendously. My Patreon members are the ones that make this channel possible, so they deserve a huge thank you as always, especially the ones in the captain level. Thanks again for watching and see you guys in the next one.